sprawling, vibrant land is Hyrule.
Echoes of Wisdom looks like a great game that I would enjoy. Shame that new games are this expensive. This is where it would go if I had it, right between the Eric Clapton Journeyman CD and that Spelunky 2 diorama thing I made last month. While I put that game in my letter to Santa here, why not make a diorama of it? A game-accurate diorama of a game that I have never played before, which makes a lot of sense. Yay! Hello and welcome to my little crafting place. Let's pick up some of this really old and crumbly polymer clay that I have here. That's the best way to kick things off with pain and suffering. Kneading the stuff is like trying to soften a boulder or something like the rubber tires of a really big heavy-duty farm vehicle. I decided I would first start off with Ganon.
Join me, Link, and I will make your face the greatest in Korodai, or else you will die.
This is mainly because I didn't have much faith in my sculpting skills, so I said, why not start with the hardest figure of this diorama, and if it does go well, make everything else. I didn't want to sculpt everything and then realize I wasn't able to pull off a convincing Ganon figure. Oh, and by the way, the scene that I'm going for is the final battle against Ganon, or so I think at least. I haven't played the game yet. I made a bowl and started adding the little triangular pig nose that Ganon has in this game. I then took a strip of clay and put it on the lower part of Ganon's head, which would make his lower jaw. I then went on to making his cheeks from 2 small pieces of clay and started to blend all of these bits together. I also went back to the nose and cut a better shaped triangle and attached it to his face. From there I added eyebrows and also defined his eyes a little bit better. Now I focused on his lower jaw and looked where exactly I would attach the ivory tusks he's got. Well, is it actually ivory? Poachers would hunt Ganon down. Does that make Link a poacher? Oh well, Navy's definitely a poacher.
Hey, listen!
Anywho, I made those and put them on his lower jaw. I then added more mass around their base and removed the tusks temporarily just so I could work on his facial features a bit better. I then took one of these pointy sculpting tools and added his nostrils. From there I was only really missing his ears, which I put together from 2 small slabs of clay. I tried to give them some movement and detached them from his head, but since I'm not working with a clay rig and also holding the now rather soft clay in my fingers, I ended up pressing them against his head a little bit too much. Anyways, I smoothed everything out with some rubbing alcohol and started working on the rough shape of his body. It's pretty much one big ball that I cut a piece off where his head would go. In the meantime, I put his head into this little oven to bake. This would save my progress, so to speak, and stop me from deforming his head every time I need to touch it. But my oven here wouldn't work, and I didn't really know why. Yeah, it was just unplugged. Now it's all good. While a delicious polymer clay Ganon head was baking in the oven,
so good and tasty.
I started working on the part that I dreaded the most, which are his humanoid-esque hands. Hands are just really hard to draw and sculpt in general. I figured I would take a small slab of clay and cut the individual fingers out of it. This proved to be a better method than attaching each figure individually. I actually wasn't happy with the first version I made and decided to remake them. From there I attached the thumb and it was done. In the meantime, his head hardened in the oven, so I could take it out and start working on his body. I decided I would carve out the shape of his shirt, but this ultimately didn't really work out and looked rather off, so I started all over. I made another bowl, carved a hole out of it, and attached Ganon's head in there. I then made a strip of clay and wrapped it around his body. From there I cut it to size and removed any excess. To improve the edge a bit, I figured I would wrap a thin strip of clay around the perimeter of his shirt, or jacket, or whatever it is that he's actually wearing. I will just call it the smoking from now on. I attached a piece of clay around his smoking and smoothed it out, which improved the edge of it. I then made several tiny clay spheres, and I say sphere because I don't want to say Ganon balls. I made them and attached them around his chest. Those would be the big necklace he's wearing. I also put these tiny fangs of sorts into the bigger Ganon ball, I mean sphere, to get this piece of jewelry to be as game accurate as possible. I then realized the body was a little bit, and by that I mean quite a bit, too long. This wasn't a huge deal since I was able to cut the excess off quite easily. That's mainly because there wasn't a lot of detail around his lower Ganon parts, I mean lower pelvic region, so it could be cut off. Ganon's got no business reproducing here, he's no Bowser. Anywho, I removed it and smoothed out all evidence of it. The only real annoyance was that I had to remake his smoking a little bit. From here I started working on his skirt, I guess, because Ganon is a tough guy with a smoking and a skirt. I attached each of these pieces of his lower garment and added a little belt around his waist. This did also hide the transition between the dress pieces and his body a little bit better. I quickly put together his legs and attached them with no major issues. Finally, now that I was happy with his body, I put everything back into the oven to bake. Now it was time to work on his arms. I quickly put together the global shape of them by attaching 3 small balls of clay together. From there, I started blending them and giving him his tough guy gym bro arm muscles.
How big do you want them? Normal? Beatty? And for the ladies, hairy.
You will see how remaking things will be a common theme throughout this whole build. The first step of the rebuilding process, so to speak, was to try to improve upon his hands. I shortly went back to trying to attach individual fingers to a slab of clay, but it really didn't work out so well. Also, somehow, one of his hands that I made looked way bigger than the other one. In fact, it looked absurdly large. So I thought I would simply take a ball of clay, shape it into a hand, cut the fingers into it again and bend them downwards so it looks like a closed hand. And this is the result of it. Even though I wanted for one of his hands to be more open, making them close down like this looked a little bit better. I removed that giant hand, attached a new one and carved all of the muscles into the arm again, because again, that arm is still soft clay and while touching and working on it, it got deformed and lost its shape. Oh, and also the little fangs here fell off from his necklace, so I had to glue them back on. I now put the arms into the oven alongside 2 small ball pieces of his necklace because those also fell off. Sometimes these smaller clay pieces are just really finicky. While that was baking, I quickly put together his cape from a big and thin clay piece. Once the arms finished baking, I took out the small necklace beads and glued them back on with some CA glue. I then drilled holes into his body where his arms would go and attached 1 small piece of wire into each one of them. I also made the same hole on his arms, which by now were fully baked and hardened. I put some CA glue over the whole assembly and attached his arms. And now that those were in place, I put the cape on top of all of it. I also attached a little clay belt of sorts around the upper perimeter of the cape. I then made these shoulder pieces and also wrapped a small string of clay around them. From there, I attached the horns on top of them. I also made smaller horns and attached those on the wrist rings he's got. With all of that said and done, Ganon was finally finished. At this point I was working on him for about 2 days and felt attached burned out, to be honest with you all. Because just before that I finished that Spelunky 2 diorama I made also a video about. Go check that out, by the way, it's pretty awesome. It was also Friday, so I was looking forward to a little break from crafting stuff. The weekend passed and I did get to relax a little bit and went back to this Echoes of Wisdom diorama on Monday. And the very first thing I decided to do is to remake the whole Ganon figure. Yes, pretty much the whole thing. I just really hated that stiff and awkward position he's had. He was devoid of all sense of movement, which is one of the things that I wanted to capture the most. So I detached all of the pieces and firstly made his head a bit larger by adding a piece of clay on the upper and lower part of his skull. I also quickly put together yet another central body piece and attached the head in a way so he is more hunched down of sorts. That's another thing that I really hated about that previous version. His head was oddly sunken into his body. He looked like he had no neck at all.
It was just like an out-of-body experience for me.
I then went to add a bit more clay to his lower jaw and bulk it up a bit. Here's the finished Ganon head version 2.0.
Not bad, not bad.
Since my clay is old, I picked up a pasta roller that I found around home that nobody's using anymore. It's one of those kitchen gadget thingies you buy at a discount, think you're gonna use it, and then use it once and abandon it forever. Until I pick it up and make a mess by trying to condition a bunch of old polymer clay. Needless to say, it was causing more harm than good, so I went back to shaping things exclusively by hand. I made his shirt again, and this time around gave it more movement by detaching it from his body, just a little bit around the edges. I then remade his skirt, and already the whole thing was looking infinitely better than that first version I made before. I was hoping I could reuse at least his legs, but even those looked off to me, so I made new ones which were way more detailed. I then balanced Ganon on a few wooden pieces that I failed to use in my previous Spelunky 2 diorama and shoved him into the oven. Go watch that video to know more about the wood lore behind Stan's crafting place. I now decided I would simply attach the necklace pieces onto his body. But make it more realistic by actually making a necklace, which is what I should have done from the get-go. I used his old discarded body to get the approximate circumference down. From there I attached all of the beads of his necklace on it. In the meantime, Ganon finished his baking process and here's how he looks. He looks great, like he just came back from a chiropractor visit and lost his stiffness. I continued attaching beads to the necklace and did a test fit before finishing off 2 small details on it. Those are the gem piece that is in the middle of the big necklace bead and then also those small fangs which are present on the previous version. Since last time I ran into problems sculpting his arms, where I would deform them while holding them in my fingers, I decided I would do it properly and make a very primitive rig first. It's simply a piece of wire attached to one of those wooden planks from before. I then put a little snowman on them and started shaping him into a muscular Ganon arm. I then also made a new hand, which after all of the practice from before looked great now, and attached it to his arm. I then only had to attach the thumb to it and shape it a bit more. This time around his left hand was also open as it should be. I then also quickly added the wrist rings he's got, or whatever those would be called, that wrist armor thing, I guess. Since last time the shoulder pieces came out a touch deflated and deformed, I decided I would take 2 identical pieces of clay and press them against the same tiny rubber bouncy ball that I had on hand. This made sure the curvature of them was very similar if not identical. I also made a new, more wavy cape and attached everything back on. I then added a little bit of battle damage to some of his armor and baked the whole thing. I also decided it was time to bake the necklace. I hung it up like this and put it into the oven. Once everything was baked, I cut a bunch of clay pieces like this and attached them to his wrist armor or rings or whatever you wanna call them. I also attached those two big horns that go on his shoulder blades. I then put his necklace in place, which I only had to cut down to size a little bit. And so, here's the finished Ganon version 2.0. I managed to make him look way more professional with actual movement to him, and what's more important, actually more game accurate, which really is the final goal here. I now was only missing his weapon. It's this double-sided spear of sorts. Since making anything more technical like this with clay is really tough, I decided that I needed something else. After looking around for a suitable stick, I realized that this model kit here, that I by the way never got to finish, did have the perfect size in its spruce, so I cut a piece out of it. I then attached two smaller pieces of plastic to it, and already the basic shape of his weapon was ready. Now I started working on the rest of his spear, and those pieces had to be made from clay against my will. There was simply nothing else I could find around home that was of the right shape and size. Anywho, I made those from clay and put them into the oven to bake. I then also improved upon the shape of the main piece of his weapon by attaching small bits of clay to its ends. Since I cannot bake plastic like this, I had to harden it with a hairdryer. This didn't fully work, but they were hard enough where I didn't find it to be a problem. I then cut the weapon in half, since this would make attaching it to his hands much easier. I took out the pieces I baked before and gave them a more polygonal and sharper appearance by sanding each side of them. This made them look way more defined. I then cut into these pieces and attached them by using these hair-thin metal bits, which were actually harvested from a disposable razor blade. I then drilled into the main pieces of his weapon, attached a wire in there, and put the whole thing together. I then put each half of the weapon into Ganon's hand by using a generous amount of CA glue. And here, finally, here's the finished Ganon figure. Overall, it took me approximately one whole week of my free time to get him to look like this. Honestly, I thought he looked pretty good, definitely better than that horrible 1.0 version from a few days ago. I decided I would now sculpt Zelda. This didn't take nowhere near as long. I made a small bowl roughly the shape of her head and added thin slices of clay to form her hair. I then put a tiny ball in the middle of her face, which would make her nose. Carefully made her jewelry from itty bitty teeny tiny strips of clay. Quickly I put on her hood, cut it to size and refined its shape. I then put her on her body and made some Lego-esque hands, making sure that she could hold her future wand without having to use too much glue. I wanted to make the connection tight so the weapon would simply snap into her hand once those were baked. I then posted an update over on my Patreon and this time around also over on Reddit, which is where Perfect Difference 19 asked if I would add any echoes to the diorama. Since apes together strong, I thought this was a great idea and I decided to add an echo to it.
Patrick, it smells like something crawled in your brain and died.
That's the creative process at work!
A whiz rope. Strategically chosen to be the green one, mainly because the light blue one would be harder to paint, and because the red one would blend too much with the overall reddish/purple colors of the base of the diorama. Now I quickly went back to the Zelda figure and changed her pose. I wanted her to be frozen mid-action while she is summoning the green whiz rope. Once her pose was clear, I started working on her weapon. The initial idea was to wrap clay around a wooden toothpick, but after messing around with that, I realized it was better to wrap a piece of wire around it. That's mainly because the polymer clay in thin strips like this is way too floppy and constantly loses its shape. But then the wire was way too stiff and wrapping it around like this was nearly impossible. So what I used here was in fact solder wire, and even then it wasn't all that easy to wrap it around the toothpick. Eventually though, I pulled it off and was happy with it. I baked Zelda entirely at this point too, secured her head using a piece of wire, did the same with her feet and snapped her weapon into her hands. I was quite happy with how it all turned out. So now it was time to start working on the whiz rope. I think the whiz rope was the only thing in this build that came out perfect on the very first try. I didn't have to remake anything at all. I took one ball of clay and put another slab on top of it, blended them together and carved out his face with a ballpoint sculpting tool, put some arms on him and added the beads of his necklace. I then put his hands on and made a pizza dough shaped piece of clay which I cut to size. This would become the lower part of his head. I put the top part over it, added some eyes, and he was done. And not only that, I thought he looked really good too. Now I made Zelda's companion tree from a tiny ball of clay and performed some head surgery on Zelda, all of that without any sort of anesthesia. Put a wire into her head and stuck tree on top of it. Nice and gory. So here's all of the figures the way they looked for now. I still think the coolest was the whiz rope. I couldn't stop playing around with him. Ooh, I'm a flying whiz rope. I now took a drill and shoved wire into his ass. This way I could hold on to him much better while painting him later on. Now before any painting there was still two things to make. The base that everything would stand on and that fireball that Ganon shoots at you that you're supposed to bounce back at him, including all of the special effects that surround that ball of fire. So I started with the base. I had to imitate the tiled floor from that last Ganon fight. I took some of this dense cardboard, similar to something like hardboard, and cut a square out of it. They made some strips like this and thought I would glue them on, but that whole thing felt a bit flimsy, so I started looking for a suitable replacement around home. First thing I found was this box from an old graphics card, but it was way too flexible. After looking around some more, I found the top of a Snoopy puzzle, which seemed to be the perfect base for the diorama. I covered the whole thing in wood filler and stippled it around, which would give it some basic texture. I set that European apartment wall looking thing aside to dry and started working on the tiles. I took out the previous cardboard and drew the center tiles on there. My technical drawing skills are non-existent and I barely remember anything from high school in general, so I had to look up a ton of tutorials online on how to make an hexagon and whatnot. After suffering on these tiles for a while, eventually, I cut out all of the pieces and started gluing them on the base using some white PVA glue. Once that was done, I went back to the cardboard and drew out the rest of the tiles. I thought I would cut them out and lay them next to the stuff that I glued on already. That's when I realized the center tiles weren't actually centered on the base I made, so I had to take them off. That took way too long and was also really messy. Once all of the tiles were removed, I took a look at the base and it was a total disaster. It soaked up some of the wood filler and became soft and flimsy. It completely lost all of its hardness, so I had to start thinking about a different idea for the base. Now you see, ideally one uses XPS foam for terrain bases like this, but I didn't have any on hand, so I started messing around with the cardboard again. I cut out some pieces of the tiles I made, and that's when I realized I didn't think about the offset when drawing them. By that I mean I didn't calculate in the blank space that is in between the tiles once they are cut out and laid down. Since I didn't want to redo the whole technical drawing of the tiles, I started messing around with them to see if I could press texture into the cardboard. Similarly with how you would do it with XPS foam, actually. This worked out quite well, but then when I spray painted it with the airbrush, I realized the ugly, fuzzy texture that all of that carving left behind. So I gave up on the cardboard idea entirely and decided I would make a trip to the next big hardware store that sells XPS foam. Before anything though, I made another guide of the tiles. This took quite a while to make, and I also remade it a bunch of times, because again, my technical drawing skills aren't really the best. Though, ultimately it came out quite good. I came back from the hardware store and cut out an equally sized piece of foam. I then put the guide on top of it and secured it all with some sticky tape. Now I drew over the drawing again with a ballpoint pen, making sure to press down on it sufficiently so it would show in the foam later on. I then removed the guide and guess what? It didn't work. Well, not really. Even though I pressed into the drawing so hard it almost ripped in certain places, it barely showed through on the XPS foam. I also completely messed up that base while trying to get everything to show properly using different sculpting tools and also an acrylic wash. Here's another secret about my crafting skills, and it's that I have in fact never worked with XPS foam before. I started messing around with it like a wild monkey would and actually learned something from the whole process. So after messing the whole thing up, it became obvious that instead of using the ballpoint pen, I should just cut into the guide with a hobby knife. That seemed to be the only way of getting the lines to show through properly, so I did just that. And this better had to work because obviously this also meant I was going to destroy the guide I made before. Luckily, it did work out, and I only had to widen these cuts I made with the hobby knife. I simply stuck one of the silicone tip tools into these cuts and wiggled it around a little bit. The longer lines, I widened them by simply using a ruler. I then widened everything further by using this other sculpting tool I had around. Now I gave the base some texture using some sculpting tools and also a small ball of aluminum foil that I crunched together into the shape of a rock of sorts. Now my goal was to fill out the crevices with wood filler, but I didn't know if the wood filler I had would work well with XPS foam. So I took out the previous base I made and used it as a test subject. Somehow the wood filler was taking a very long time to fully cure on XPS foam. In fact, it took about a day or so to harden, when usually it takes like 4 to maybe 6 hours. So I started working on the LED assembly. This was very easy to make. I cut out another square XPS foam piece, cut another hole into it the size of the battery pack, put PVA glue on it, spread it around and put the base on top of all of that. I then put a bunch of heavy objects on top, then decided I would put something even heavier on it and left everything there to dry. I then came back on the next day and started sanding the sides of the diorama base. Since the wood filler experiment went well with the previous messed up base, I now put wood filler on this one as well and set it aside to dry. While the diorama base was drying, it was finally time to start painting things. I like to prime figures and scale models with the so-called Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 from a company called Mr. Hobby, a name that just rolls off the tongue. This is a lacquer-based primer that's some of the absolute nastiest paint that you could possibly use for crafting projects, but despite being utter lung cancer, it sprays and grips really well. These lacquer-based primers need to be mixed with lacquer thinner, so I did just that on my palette here, and then loaded the paint into the airbrush. And while I was in the middle of painting things, my airbrush decided to completely stop working. It seems like everything was going wrong in this crafting project. That airbrush in fact was giving me problems for a while now. I guess I decided it was finally time to die on me. May that cheap thing rest in peace. I ordered a new one based on recommendations online, and while I was waiting for it to arrive at my doorstep, my diorama base here was finally dry. So I sanded the top of it and also a bit the opening I made for the LED assembly. Now it actually looked good. It really did resemble laid brickwork, similar to the one from the game. After a bunch of days, my new airbrush came in and wow, what a difference. It was spraying absolutely flawlessly. I covered the figures in white primer in no time and focused on the base. I felt that lacquer thinner was way too hot of a chemical for the XPS foam to handle, so I used this water-based gray primer instead. I covered the base in it, and while that thing was drying, I thought I would cover the figures in black acrylic paint. I would then add some white paint on top to create on them some basic lighting and some basic contrast in general. I also gave some light effects like these to the diorama base. The idea behind this is that once you cover it in paint, some of this still shows through and gives the whole thing a more believable finish with a ton of depth to it. In essence, it helps getting rid of that toy-like appearance that is easy to run into when painting figures and scale models. Before starting to paint the sculptures of Ganon and Zelda in the Wizrobe, I mixed these three colors together and base coated all the tile work from before. I then took some of this green paint and started covering the Wizrobe in it. Then I thought, why not use the airbrush to cover him much quicker, so I did just that, and he already looked pretty nice. I then mixed some white into the green paint and started adding highlights to his head, face, and also to his arms. Since again this was taking too long and I'm way too impatient, I took out the airbrush booth and coated the head in that lighter shade of green. From there I mixed black and white paint into the green from before and added lighter and darker areas to his head. This is very much the same process that miniature painters use to paint things like, say, Warhammer figures. On scale models, I think painting lights on like that looks a little bit off, but on video game characters like these, it was looking really great. Way nicer than just simply covering them in a single layer of paint and calling it quits. Issue is this takes a long time to do, and even longer for me because I'm not that experienced doing this type of work. Anywho, once the head and his hands were done, I used some masking tape and covered the recently painted areas in it. This is because I needed to cover the rest of his face and body in an even lighter shade of green. Once that was done, I removed the tape and started painting light and shadows on the rest of the figure. Using black paint on a figure like this is quite nerve-wracking for me, but it turned out just fine here. I then used some of this color here to paint the necklace and the golden rings he's got around his wrists. From there I took a pencil and drew out the triangular patterns the Wizrobes have in Echoes of Wisdom around the bottom of their body. I then base coated them in the same color as the necklace. I took some white primer and painted his eyes in a first coat of white, added more depth to his necklace and painted on the black part in the middle of his body. I then mixed these two colors together to get a base coat done on the emerald in the middle of the necklace. I then added sharper lightning effects to it, and I was actually quite proud of how that emerald piece came out. I then set the Wizrobe aside and base coated Zelda pink and Ganon blue. I quickly painted Wizrobe's eyes pink and focused on Zelda again. I now base coated her yellow. In fact, the reason to coat her pink first was because yellow takes a million gazillion layers to cover unless the figure is primed in a pink tone first. Then it will cover way quicker. I now started hand painting Zelda and I followed the exact same procedure from before. I would base coat a part in the target color, like blue for her hood, and then I would add procedurally lighter and darker coats of that same blue color, until I got the contrast to look just right. Naturally, there was again the nerve-wracking part of painting her eyes with pure black paint, but it turned out quite well. Tree was so tiny, I actually used a toothpick when painting the facial features there. Ultimately, after a solid, let's say 8 hours or so of work, This is how the figures came out. I felt like a milestone was achieved in the crafting process, so I posted it over on my Patreon page. Then realized nobody saw it either way, because this is my second video and I don't have anybody on Patreon. So follow me on Patreon and subscribe, I'll go and get ya. Here's a little piece of advice. When doing any lighter parts of a figure, cover them in bone white first. This is why I painted certain parts of Ganon in this beige color, like his horns, or his eyes, or the necklace. This then makes covering these parts in other lighter shades way easier. I took some red paint and mixed it together with black to start painting his shoulder pieces. I used purely black on his wrist rings and added some lighter shades to them to make them pop a little bit more. His cape was covered in the same red as the shoulder blades. I then painted some gold effects around the shoulder pieces, which looked quite nice. I also added those symbols he's got on his cape. From there, the rest of the process was pretty much the same as with Zelda or with the Wizrobe. I took the base color, a lighter shade of ultramarine blue in this case, and started clearing it up more and more until I got the contrast I wanted on Ganon. This is how he looked for now. I wanted his weapon to be purple. During that battle it's lit up like this. Problem is I don't have a pre-mixed dropper bottle of purple, so I had to make my own. Also, I had to use this fine arts oriented acrylic paint for it. That's because when I mix the so-called blood red color from Vallejo with blue, I get a brown tone. That is because the blood red has some yellow mixed in there. It's actually slightly orangey. So I had no other option but mix purple using craft acrylics. They are fine, but then don't cover nearly as well as the dedicated Vallejo acrylics I used until now. They're also way more prone to leaving a texture behind, but oh well, I tried my best. Now, while that purple was drying, I mixed together some browns and painted his clothing. I was in essence going back and forth between the clothing and his weapon, covering them both more and more with each layer of paint. Eventually I added lightning effects to the weapon, which had the peculiarity of being reversed. I painted it as if the light was coming from the bottom instead of from the top. This was to imitate the lightning effects that are on his weapon in the game. Once that was done, I added some minor things to the painting job, like these red lines on his clothes. I painted his eyes, finished all of the parts that were still covered in bone white, and finished painting his necklace. Here's a family shot of all of the figures. The way they looked right now, I think they came out reasonably well. Now, purple and these crafting acrylics or fine arts acrylics didn't leave me alone quite yet. Because guess what the color of the floor in the game is? It's also purple. So I mixed some more of it, well actually a lot more, using one of these bigger cups. Then realized it came out way too dark. Put some white into another cup and slowly started adding the darker purple from the first container until I was happy with the shade I got. Initially I tried to cover each tile with a brush, but it didn't seem to work as well as I expected. Again, it's because these acrylics simply don't cover as well as the dedicated ones from before, which are meant for scale models or miniature figures. These here are cheaper and less pigmented, which is, well, you know, what makes paint cheaper or more expensive. It's mainly the amount of pigment they have in them and what type of pigment it is actually. Since the brush technique wasn't quite working, I took out a makeup brush and attempted a dry brushing technique, which also looked terrible. So I went back to the airbrush, which by the way I now swapped out from a 0.5 tip to a 0.3 tip, since the 0.5 was spraying way too much paint at the time. So actually having the wider 0.5 tip would now be much more useful than the 0.3 one. Anyway, I covered the whole base in the lighter purple from before. I let the paint pool a lot just to get it to cover quicker. Since I let it pool so much, and since paint just like the wood filler seems to take a lot of time to cure on XPS foam, I took out a hairdryer to harden that paint way faster. I then repeated this process several times, and for the last coats I used a slightly darker shade of purple. That actually is what I should have used from the beginning, but oh well, stuff gotta go wrong or this wouldn't be me, you know. I then took the base out of the airbrush booth, and that's when it hit me that there was no way of cheating myself around this. I absolutely had to paint this whole thing in the same way as the figures, tile by tile. There was no easy dry brushing or a wash technique that I could apply and get away with it. So I started by covering all of the crevices with a homebrew wash that's cheap acrylic paint plus a touch of dish soap to break the surface tension and make it flow much better. I made sure to only target the crevices and a small area around them. It was a very controlled wash of sorts. I then started adding highlights to the edges of each panel, which really made them pop. This here was the finished diorama base. It looked surprisingly good. I now drilled some holes into Ganon's feet, put some wire in there, and secured him to the base with a touch of PVA or wood glue. Now in back to the whiz rope. You see, in actuality, my goal here was to make him look like Zelda was still in the process of spawning him into the battle. There is a brief moment in the game where spawned into action echoes look slightly yellowish. So I also decided I would cover my whiz rope in some yellow. Not just any yellow, but this one right here from Tamiya, which is a clear acrylic. If you were to spray this paint on a window, you would tint it yellow, but it would still be see-through. These acrylics can also be thinned with a lacquer thinner. Before ruining my whiz rope's paint job, I decided I would take out this test subject I made ages ago. Since it seemed to work just fine, I started spraying the paint on the whiz rope. I had the sensation that maybe the lacquer thinner would eat away at the acrylic paint on the figure, but none of that happened. In fact, he came out looking great. That shine, I would get rid of it later with some matte varnish. For now, I set him aside to dry and started cutting out some yellow triangles in different sizes. You see, I wanted to imitate the particle effects that surround all echoes while they are being spawned into the battle. Before attaching them to the whiz rope, and since by now his paint was fully cured, I covered him in some matte acrylic varnish. That's how he looked without all of that shine. I'm actually not convinced if that's better or worse, but oh well, at least at the time I thought it looked better. I now put some PVA glue in my palette and slowly and painfully added one by one all of the little triangles on the whiz rope. It took a while, but it was also oddly therapeutic. This is how he came out in the end. I then made a circle from a piece of plastic that I recycled from a Coca-Cola bottle and painted it in the same clear yellow tone from before. Though this time around I thinned it with some rubbing alcohol, just so it wouldn't pool as much. In the middle of the process, I actually decided I would make two discs like this. I then cut a slit into the lower part of his head and attached one of these discs there with a bit of CA glue. That actually took me a few attempts. Then I also attached the second disc on the front of the head and let the glue fully dry. I took two small cotton balls and painted them in this light green shade and attached them to the hands of the whiz rope. This way he looked like he was about to attack Ganon. I then decided I would mix some purple and paint a few more strands of cotton. I then attached them to Ganon's spear. This was to imitate that ghostly appearance his weapon has around it. From there I attached the whiz rope to the floor and the diorama started to look more and more finished. Now the yellow triangles didn't leave me alone quite yet. I still had to add those 4 triangle pieces that float over the stronger echoes. I put 4 triangles on a thin piece of wire and added another 4 on the opposite side of each triangle that was already attached, just so the wire wouldn't be as visible. I then put this whole stick of triangles on the whiz rope. I then put this stick on the whiz rope again and made sure it wouldn't fall off. Here's how he looked with all of the particle effects finished. Now I put some wire into Zelda's feet and attached her to the base using some PVA glue. During that process, one of the discs fell off from the whiz rope. I attached that back on with CA glue and made this little rig to keep it in place while it cures. Now it was time to work on the ball of fire that Ganon shoots at you. I went through several things before settling on what I would use for the ball. The first idea was to use one of these balls from the inside of a roll-on deodorant, but the ones I found were all too big and out of scale for the diorama. Eventually I settled on this white ball, which in actuality is a Christmas tree ornament. I thought I would put it on a black straw and glue it all on the base, but first I filled out the hole I made before, which turned out to be way too big now. I filled it with a bit of XPS foam and glued it in place with wood glue. I now cut out random bits from a Coca-Cola bottle and glued them on the ball with very small amounts of CA glue. This is because CA glue eats away at clear plastic quite easily, but in my experience it's okay to use it in smaller quantities like here. Eventually this is how the ball of fire ended up looking. I now took out my whole arsenal of clear acrylics from Tamiya and started coating the ball in them. The first coat was done with yellow. I also cut out some more strips of clear plastic which I would use as an additional particle effect. Those I also painted yellow. From there I proceeded to add depth to everything with clear orange paint. After that I finished the effect off by adding small amounts of clear red and also clear blue color. I now focused on the base. First I covered with purple that XPS foam a bit that I added before. I then painted some lightning effects directly underneath the ball. I started with yellow and topped it off with some white. From there I decided the edges of the base looked really boring. So I covered them in some gray, then in some dark blue, and finally finished the shadows with some black paint. Now the base looked way more interesting. I made a small incision and stuck the extra bits of clear plastic in there. This imitated quite nicely the particle effects around the ball that pop up for a brief moment when Ganon shoots at you. I removed the ball temporarily because I still wanted to put an LED inside it. Lit up like this, the ball looked way better and way more game accurate. I soldered 2 wires onto the LED and put it inside the black straw. I glued the LED on top of the straw using some CA glue. I then put this all into the ball and also secured it with a bit of CA glue. This whole assembly then went into the base and it was secured on the bottom side with a bit of hot glue. Which hot glue belongs somewhere in crafting hell for me for just how messy it is. But since it's nice and strong, I elevate it back to surface level. I attached the battery pack to the bottom of the diorama in that little hole I made for it. From here I only had to solder the wires together and it was all done. Well, actually, you see, that is almost. I decided I would hide the bottom of the base of the ball with a bit of cotton that I attached with a tiny bit of PVA glue. Also, where I put the glue on the ball to attach the particle effects made from that clear plastic, I could still see some of that glue sticking out. When that ball was lit up, it was quite visible. So I covered it up in some more cotton. Now I lit up the ball and it looked great. And you would think this project here is done, but no, there's still one detail missing, and it's this little particle effect I made off camera for Zelda's wand. I glued it on there with some CA glue. And somehow every time I touched the Zelda figure, that yellow disc would fall off from the whiz rope. This time around I made sure to secure it with as much CA glue as possible and let my rig here hold it in place for a solid hour or so. And once that was dry, guess what? I was finally officially done with this diorama. Now that it's finished, and since I'm a crafting YouTuber, I, just like every other crafting YouTuber out there, I must absolutely have some fancy glamour shots of the diorama in my video. So let's get that B-roll rolling. And if you made it this far into the video, congrats and big thanks for watching the whole thing. If you did enjoy it, please consider subscribing. I am planning to upload consistent videos about every 2 or 4 weeks, depending on how big the project at hand is gonna be. Since making these videos does take a while, I also recommend you to follow me for free on my Patreon page. There I post frequent updates while I work on the next build. Also consider becoming a paid Patreon member, which would mean the absolute world to me. Paid Patreon members get access to a whole bunch of cool perks, like early video uploads or getting their name featured in my videos, so make sure to check those out. With all of that said, thanks a lot for stopping by and see you in the next crafting video. Bye!